Imagine opening a government census document from 1851, a routine administrative record, columns of names, occupations, household sizes, and finding, buried between the entries, a place that official maps had already begun erasing. Not a footnote, not a relic, a living category, a heritage designation that someone, somewhere, still believed was real enough to write down. That single detail rewrites everything you thought you knew about when Tartaria disappeared. Because here is the thing most historians skip over. Tartaria did not vanish in a single dramatic moment. There was no declaration, no final battle, no official abolition. It dissolved, slowly, quietly, unevenly, through bureaucratic paperwork, administrative reorganization, and the ordinary decisions of clerks who had to choose between old vocabulary and new. And in 1851, that process was still happening. The word was still appearing in official records. The people it described were still identifying with it. Then those records vanished too. To understand what makes this significant, you need to understand what Tartaria actually was, because it was not what most people assume. For nearly 300 years, from the 16th century onward, Tartaria was one of the most consistently mapped regions on Earth. Cartographers in Amsterdam, Paris, London, and Lisbon filled the vast interior of the Eurasian continent with the label Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. The name stretched across millions of square kilometers, from the Ural Mountains eastward through Central Asia, through Siberia, all the way into Manchuria. This was not a fringe designation. This was mainstream European geography. The maps were expensive, authoritative, and widely reproduced. Merchants used them. Armies consulted them. Governments made decisions based on them. And yet, by the mid-19th century, those same governments had begun quietly retiring the word from their official vocabulary. Russian imperial expansion had carved the region into administrative provinces. Orenburg, Tobolsk, the Kazakh steppe divided into jurisdictional units. British diplomatic correspondence had shifted to more granular terminology. The word Tartary was becoming archaic in the language of power, which is exactly why 1851 matters. That year was not random. It sits at a precise institutional crossroads. In Britain, the 1851 census was the most sophisticated the country had ever attempted, the first to seriously grapple with birthplace as a category. For a global empire in contact with populations it barely understood, this created an immediate problem. What do you write down when someone's origin doesn't fit any of your existing boxes? Across Europe, similar pressures were building. The political upheavals of 1848 had forced a wave of administrative reorganization. Russian imperial authorities were simultaneously attempting to document nomadic steppe populations, an effort that was incomplete by design, since the people being counted organized themselves according to frameworks that had nothing to do with Russian provincial boundaries. Into this moment of institutional uncertainty, certain documents show something remarkable. Individuals recorded not under the new administrative terminology, not under any modern national category, but under a heritage designation that the official world was in the process of abandoning. Tartaria, appearing in census-adjacent records not as history, but as identity. Someone wrote it down. Someone on the other side of that desk let it stand. The question is why? And the answer is more human than most people expect. Consider the position of a census official in 1851, faced with a person whose origin falls outside every standardized category available to him. He has a form. The form has columns. The columns assume a world that has been neatly divided into legible, governable units. And in front of him is a person whose answer to "where are you from?" does not fit any of those units, because the unit they identify with has been officially retired, but not yet replaced with anything that makes sense to them. What does he write? Sometimes, apparently, he wrote what he heard. He wrote the word that the person in front of him used. He reached back into an older geographic vocabulary, one that was still present in the educated consciousness of mid-19th-century Europe, and he recorded it because it was the closest available approximation of the truth. That act of pragmatic documentation, repeated across multiple records in multiple jurisdictions, created a paper trail. A brief, fragile moment when the old world and the new world overlapped on the same line of an official form. Then the forms were filed. The institutions that held them were reorganized. The filing systems were redesigned. And what had been legible became, incrementally, lost. Here is where the vanishing requires precision, because it was not one event, and it was not deliberate. Archival loss in the 19th and 20th centuries happened through accumulation. Administrative reorganizations transferred records between institutions, sometimes more than once. The professionalization of archival practice, which accelerated dramatically across the latter half of the 19th century, involved systematic decisions about what to keep, what to consolidate, and what to discard as outdated. Documents that belonged to one institutional framework were often recategorized when that framework was dissolved, emerging on the other side under different headings, in different collections, indexed under terminology that bore no relationship to their original content. For records relating to steppe and Central Asian populations specifically, there were additional disruptions. The Russian imperial archival system, which held custody of enormous quantities of documentation relating to progressively absorbed territories, experienced catastrophic disruption in the 20th century. Revolutionary reorganization, wartime destruction, the broad administrative transformation of the Soviet period. Each wave altered what survived, what was accessible, and what was cataloged in ways that outside researchers could actually search. British holdings were similarly fragmented across competing institutional actors: the East India Company, the India Office, the Foreign Office, each maintaining separate records that were never fully integrated, and each passing through multiple rounds of reorganization as the institutions themselves were dissolved or restructured. The result is not a conspiracy. It is something more mundane and, in some ways, more disturbing. It is the normal behavior of large bureaucratic systems across time. Records that were never designed to survive long enough to become historically significant, that were created to serve an immediate administrative purpose and then filed away, drifting across institutions, losing their original context, becoming unsearchable, effectively invisible, without anyone having made a single deliberate decision to hide them. What survives, then, is trace evidence, fragmentary references in other documents, descriptions of records that no longer appear to exist, the occasional entry that escaped the reorganization because it was filed under a heading that happened to survive intact. And those fragments are enough to establish something important: that the transition from one geographic imagination to another was not clean. It was not a sharp line between the old world and the new. It was a long, uneven, deeply human process, full of people who still used the old vocabulary because no adequate replacement had been handed to them, full of officials who accommodated that vocabulary because their job was to document reality, not to impose a map on it. The 1851 records are evidence of that friction, of the gap between when a word stops appearing on official maps and when it stops existing in the lives of the people it described. That gap was wider than anyone in the administrative centers of Europe wanted to acknowledge. And the documents that prove it are, largely, no longer accessible. There is a larger question buried in this, one that goes beyond Tartaria, beyond 1851, beyond any specific archive. How much of what we believe about historical transitions is shaped by the documents that survived rather than the documents that existed? When we look at the history of Central Asia in the 19th century, we are looking at a record that was created by the institutions of expansion, Russian, British, and others, and filtered through the archival priorities of those same institutions. The perspectives that fell outside those frameworks are, by definition, underrepresented. Not because they were unimportant, but because the systems designed to preserve the past were built by the same powers that were reshaping it. That asymmetry is not unique to this story. It is the condition of historical knowledge. What we know is always a function of what was written down, what was kept, and who decided it was worth keeping. The absence of certain records does not mean certain experiences did not exist. It means the administrative systems of preservation were not designed with those experiences in mind. Somewhere, in a reading room that may or may not still hold the relevant collection, there is a ledger. The ink has faded. The columns are tight, the handwriting trained to compress information into minimal space, as all administrative handwriting from that era was. And in one of those columns, in one of those entries, someone wrote a word that the world around them had already begun treating as a relic. They wrote it carefully, in the same hand they used for everything else, because to them, it was not a relic. It was the answer to the question being asked. Whether that ledger still exists, whether that entry survived the century and a half of reorganization and reclassification and ordinary institutional decay that followed, that is unknown. What is certain is that it was written, that for a brief moment, an official record and a living identity were the same thing. And then, as systems do, the record moved on. The category was retired. The word disappeared from the columns. But someone had written it down. And for a while, that was enough.